The ancient Egyptian galleries of the British Museum are justly renowned. What some people don't realise, though, is that equally remarkable objects can be seen in the galleries next door. Here you'll find relics of another ancient civilization, that of the Assyrians. One exhibit outshines all the rest and provides a startling insight into the Assyrians' rich, though sometimes brutal, culture. At the heart of the Assyrian galleries lies an extraordinary set of stone carvings. They depict a group of warriors engrossed in an unusual and violent pastime. Led by a tall behatted figure who is clearly their king, the men are shown hunting and killing a large number of lions. Unsettling to some, wondrous to many more, these are the extraordinary lion hunt reliefs. The death agonies of the lions, meticulously recorded by the ancient sculptors, are extremely vivid. For some people, they are very strong meat. Many others, though, see a grandeur and a beauty here which more than compensate for the harshness of what's being portrayed.
It is great art, and like all great art, it is the product of a religious act in which the artist has opened himself to the soul of everything, has made himself a channel for the universal soul, and it comes through the work to the viewer with impact that will last forever. The king doesn't matter. He's a forget-about-it king. The lions are what matter. They are as real as the sculptor could make them, and their reality persists in the alabaster. It persists through all the centuries between the time of their carving and now.
Obviously, in a world that's very concerned about cruelty to animals, I think people are concerned with these, but actually these are not about cruelty to animals. They are about the nobility and the force of an animal. And I think they are some of the greatest things in the British Museum. The Assyrians have got that notion of animals in movement. And I can't think of anything else of this date that has this level of understanding, sophistication and achievement, and just sheer beauty. One can look at these, I think, forever.
Well, I started coming to the museum when I was about 15 or 16. I stumbled into this collection and I've been coming back ever since. I think they are a profound experience if you just kind of let yourself go and look at it as a time when mankind was struggling to almost kind of win control of the world, and they didn't know what the world was. Whenever I have friends who come to London, I always make sure that we kind of amble down here. And I can say probably about 50% of them have kind of sat up a bit straight and say, this is a totally different sculptural, artistic, intellectual experience than probably anywhere else.
Although they aren't perhaps quite as popularly celebrated as a few of the British Museum's other exhibits, the lion hunt reliefs attract thousands of visitors each year. This pleases the staff who care for them because they realise not only how important the reliefs are, but how lucky it is that we're able to see them at all. Created around 645 BC, while the Assyrian Empire was at its height, the reliefs were buried under tons of rubble for over 2,500 years. They might never have come to light again if not for one man, an all but forgotten Victorian archaeologist called Hormuzd Rassam. Rassam looked and acted like a typical English gentleman, but he wasn't English at all, nor was he, as many people thought, a Turk. He was in fact what we today would call an Iraqi. Iraq back then wasn't the war-torn country known to us. In fact, it wasn't a country at all. It was a province of the Ottoman Empire, ignored by almost everyone except those who had an interest in the ancient past. They were drawn to the region because they knew that some 3,000 to 4,000 years earlier, the fertile land surrounding the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had given rise to some of the world's earliest civilizations, including arguably the greatest of them all, that of the Assyrians. The man who discovered more Assyrian remains than anyone else was an English explorer called Austin Henry Layard. He carried out many successful digs in the region during the 1840s. One of these took place on the site of the ancient city of Nineveh. This happened to lie just across the Tigris River from the town of Mosul, which is where Hormuzd Rassam had his home. Soon after arriving in Mosul for the first time in 1842, Layard met Rassam and instantly identified him as someone who could help him with his work.
Layard needs to have a secretary, interpreter, an assistant, someone to actually manage the whole affairs, all the difficult and day-to-day administration. And my great-grandfather, Hormuzd Rassam, takes up that role and does it so well that they both become quite good friends within a matter of weeks.
Rassam managed the money, he did a lot of managing the workmen, and he was clearly so capable that Layard found he could hardly work without him. And then, later on, when Layard himself gave up archaeology and took up a career in politics in England, the British Museum wanted someone to go out and work for them in northern Iraq. The best person that they could find was Hormuzd Rassam.
Taking over from Henry Layard was a huge responsibility for Hormuzd Rassam, who was only 26 years old at the time. He was keen to continue and expand on Layard's work, but he knew from the start that he didn't enjoy the full confidence of the British Museum's trustees.
They were rather suspicious of him because he wasn't a traditional English gentleman. The person who they felt they could rely on was Henry Rawlinson, the British consul in Baghdad. Rassam was answerable to Rawlinson, but in practice, Rassam worked as an independent agent and took all the decisions himself.
The biggest decision Rassam had to take concerned an unfortunate agreement that Henry Rawlinson entered into with a rival archaeologist, a Frenchman called Victor Place. Place had asked Rawlinson for permission to carry out excavations in the northern part of the Nineveh site. Rassam was deeply opposed to this idea because he believed that a large mound which dominated this area concealed the remains of an ancient Assyrian palace. For reasons that are hard to understand, though, Rawlinson, who was the British consul, let's not forget, chose to grant the Frenchman's request, causing a great problem for Rassam. He agonized for months over what to do. Then, unwilling to see the French walk off with a prize which he felt ought to go to Britain, he took a decisive step. Without telling Rawlinson, he instructed his workmen to go ahead and excavate the mound. To avoid detection by Monsieur Place, they were further instructed to work at night. This nocturnal adventure could easily have backfired on Hormuzd Rassam, and for a while, it looked as though it would. The first night's dig produced a few ancient objects, the second night's a few more, but the finds weren't big or exciting enough to shield him from the trouble he'd face if word leaked out of what he was doing. By night 3, he'd become seriously concerned. He needed a breakthrough, and luckily for him, one occurred. It was the first sight of a great work of art, hidden for more than 2,000 years.
One division of the workmen, after 3 or 4 hours hard labor, were rewarded by the first grand discovery of a beautiful bas-relief in a perfect state of preservation. The delight of the workmen was naturally beyond description. They all rushed to see the new discovery, and after having gazed at the bas-relief with wonder, they collected together and began to dance and sing my praises with all their might.
Rassam's most pressing problem had now been solved. Thanks to the principle of finders keepers, which prevailed among archaeologists at the time, no one could now force him off the site. Unhampered by any need for secrecy, he ordered his men to dig a massive hole in the mound. As expected, this laid bare the remains of a royal palace. The mud brick building itself had all but disappeared, but the stone slabs which had once decorated it had survived. As soon as he laid eyes on the great reliefs, Rassam realized that he'd found a masterpiece of ancient art. He wrote to Henry Layard saying, "They surpass everything yet discovered in the ruins of ancient Assyria." And that's a view that's become widely accepted since. 150 years on, the brilliance of their execution continues to astound British Museum staff. The amount of fine detail the ancient carvers managed to incorporate in their work is what particularly strikes Paul Collins, the man in charge of the Lion Hunt Gallery.
Stepping close, you get a totally different appreciation of the quality of carving. The extraordinary detail on these reliefs needs the person to get up, the viewer to come within inches, really, to see the little lion's head at the top of the king's bow, complementing the idea of this is a lion's hunt. The lion is picked up again on the bracelets of some of his officials that accompany the king in the hunting chariot. And looking at the costume of the king himself, we see extraordinary embroidery that may have been picked out in colour originally, finely incised over his entire body. Rosettes and images of the king himself, about 1 centimetre high, picked out in fine detail.
How did the Assyrian sculptors achieve this extraordinary level of detail? Nobody can say for sure, for nobody's entirely certain how the reliefs were produced. To shed more light on what the process might have been, we asked sculptor Sue Nelson to make a copy of one of the lions, using modern tools but working in the same material, alabaster, that the original sculptors used. Copying the lion itself she found relatively easy, but she couldn't work out how her ancient counterparts had managed to achieve the spectacular level of detail apparent in certain parts of the relief, such as the king's costume.
The thing about alabaster is you have to keep everything very sharp, and so that probably would have been quite a problem for them because it's likely that they wouldn't have had hardened steel. The little rosettes where they've taken the ground out, it's so fine. You think, well, how did they do that? I've used a masonry tool, and it's pretty tiny, but it's still not tiny enough to do some of those little rosettes, which are minuscule and so neat.
Sue Nelson may not have come to a firm conclusion about how the most delicate carving was done, but she has a definite opinion about something else. She believes that, contrary to what some experts have argued, the reliefs could not have been carved in situ on the palace walls.
It's hard work working upright because you're using energy to keep a mallet or something in the air. So that's why I think they would have laid the things out in a workshop. They would have designed the thing in a workshop.
The cleverness and ingenuity of their overall design, the way that one event is juxtaposed with another, sometimes foreshadowing modern art forms such as comic strips and film, are commonly agreed to be the relief's greatest attributes. It's widely agreed, too, that the design must have been the work of one artist. Who he was We simply don't know. But the astonishing quality of his work means that for many people, he's the true hero of the lion hunt reliefs.
The stonecutters were brilliant technicians, but whoever furnished the design, the concept, the ability to put so much narrative into a continuum in proportion with life in it and all that detail, as well as the overall impression, that person was, of course, a major artist.
Great artist that he was, though, the designer of the reliefs had to pay very close attention to the views of someone far more powerful than him, the king who had ordered him to create them in the first place. Represented in every one of the reliefs, the king must have taken a great interest in what they portrayed and how they looked. His power was such that any change he requested would have been carried out as a matter of course.
The king certainly supervised it and probably interfered quite a lot. He might say, well, this is lovely, I don't like this, we've given up this kind of chariot, and I think I'm slightly taller than my adjutant, so make me look bigger or something. But when they got all the details sorted out in the way that the king approved, the stonecutters came in and did their job.
Even as the reliefs neared completion, the king is thought to have asserted his mastery over the project by demanding last-minute changes. Interestingly, his dissatisfaction seems to have related not to the way he and his men were portrayed, but to the way in which the sculptors had depicted the lions.
The artists that created these wonderful images of the lions really understood the animal themselves. The muscles, the textures, they're all very familiar to the sculptor. And yet occasionally when we look at these reliefs, we find that they actually made mistakes, or at least someone thought they had made mistakes. For example, if we look at this lion lying on its back, and the end of its tail, the tuft here, has actually been shortened. And we can see in the relief the outline of the original tail, carved here, then smoothed away and recarved at a slightly lower level here. Somebody, perhaps even the king himself, had come along and realized that the tails were too long.
It's possible that Hormuzd Rassam never asked himself how big a role the king who featured in the lion hunt reliefs had played in their production and design. But he was very keen all the same to find out who that king was. Within days of uncovering the first of the reliefs, he came across some ancient inscriptions which seemed to hold the key. He knew they probably referred to the king by name, but frustratingly for him, he couldn't work out what they said. They were written in cuneiform, an ancient form of writing he couldn't understand. This was a problem, of course, but it didn't trouble him for long.
What Rassam did was he copied some of the inscriptions he found in the palace, and he sent them off to Rawlinson in Baghdad. Rawlinson could read cuneiform, and he was able to send back a message saying this is a palace of the son of Esarhaddon, of King Ashurbanipal, and this is indeed what it turned out to be.
Nothing much was known about King Ashurbanipal when his name first came to light. Nowadays, though, we know a great deal. He was, in fact, a ruler to be remembered, one of the greatest of all the Assyrian kings. He conquered Egypt and created a tremendous empire which embraced a huge swathe of what we call today the Middle East. And these weren't his only claims to fame.
He was a multifaceted personality. He wasn't just a lion-killing and enemy-slicing monarch, as you might get the impression. He was complex, and he was interested in literature and the traditional language and literature of his own culture. And this is a case in point. This is one of the tablets from Ashurbanipal's own library. He collected tablets from all over Iraq, brought them to the palace to be copied for his own use. And this is the reverse, the back of the tablet, and this area here is what we call the colophon. It's the bit which explains that it belongs to Ashurbanipal, who he says was very wise. He was given wisdom by the gods, and he was able to read cuneiform inscriptions, even ancient ones, and argue with scholars, unlike any king who went before him.
Ashurbanipal was clearly a remarkable man, even by the standards of Assyrian kings. Even so, people new to the reliefs might find it hard to accept that he could possibly have hunted and killed so many lions. Especially fanciful at first glance is a scene which seems to imply that he liked to engage in what you might call hand-to-paw combat with his leonine prey. Can anything like this really have occurred? The answer on the face of it would have to be no. Big cats aren't to be trifled with, as everybody knows. These cats, part of a breeding program being carried out at the Cotswold Wildlife Park in Oxfordshire, are Asiatic lions, like those featured in the lion hunt reliefs. Slightly smaller than the African lions we're more familiar with today, they are extremely ferocious all the same. Could Ashurbanipal and his men really have tangled with beasts like this, armed solely with swords, spears, and bows? Strange as it may seem, the true answer appears to be yes. One reason is that much older carvings like this one also show kings killing lions, suggesting that the practice had been going on in Assyria for hundreds of years. Another is that, contrary to what one might at first think, the reliefs don't record a totally uncontrolled event taking place in the wild.
If you look closely at the reliefs, you can actually see that the lions, when the story begins, are in cages. And they are released from cages, brought to an arena, an enclosed space, and the king then has ample opportunity safely to dispatch them. When wild animals are released from cages, I think whoever is in the arena is in some form of danger. But the king is always well protected. He has guards standing around with spears. And when he's in his chariot, he's accompanied by spear bearers who fight off attacking lions.
Not only was the lion hunt much more of a controlled event than first meets the eye, it also seems to have involved masses of people. This panel, easily overlooked on first viewing, shows a group of spectators climbing a nearby hill, either to get a better view of the hunt, or because they're terrified of what's going on. It tells us that the king was on public display when he killed the lions, and this may well have been central to what the hunt was all about.
Presumably Ashurbanipal had a good breakfast and went out and slaughtered them one by one, and there must have been cheers and screams, and everybody was suitably impressed at the power of their great king. A reasonable question is whether Ashurbanipal was really like that, or whether he was a puling coward who hated to do it and had to get drunk first and was glad when it was all over. His father, Esarhaddon, probably would have needed to bolster himself with some kind of chemicals, but I think Ashurbanipal lapped it up and enjoyed it wholeheartedly.
Having demonstrated his supremacy by slaughtering so many beasts, King Ashurbanipal, seen here in some striking Victorian reimaginings of his lion-hunting feats, would naturally have wanted to remind people of his prowess later in life. This, it's now thought, is what prompted the production of the reliefs. But who were the carvings meant to impress? Fewer people, it seems, than one might at first suppose.
The reliefs themselves come from a corridor which led away from the main area of the palace, and it's possible that this was the route that the king actually took on the way to the hunt. And so it's likely that the people who saw the reliefs were the king himself, of course, his courtiers, and perhaps some visiting dignitaries who were allowed to accompany him to the hunt.
Accessible only to a few back in ancient times, the reliefs are now viewable by all. A considerable number of people these days take the trouble to go and see them. Surprisingly, though, that wasn't the case when they were first unveiled, about 150 years ago. The lack of interest in them that seems to have existed back then is hard to understand. This is not least because certain other Assyrian relics, most notably the huge winged and human-headed bull and lion figures which still dominate the British Museum's Assyrian galleries, had made an enormous splash when they'd arrived at the museum a few years before. The public interest in those exhibits had been so great, it had caught the museum's trustees off guard.
They put them in a basement, their first consignment of finds, and appointed just one curator to take people round. So they were really very, very surprised when the whole thing took off and the public flocked to see them.
There were lots of people who had worked out in the Middle East, or people with relatives who'd lived in the Middle East. Photography was just beginning, and people were hunting tigers in India and having great photographs of themselves with heaps of dead animals and themselves with their rifle on top. And I think that that struck a chord with the Victorians, and when they went to the museum, they would see this as a right activity for a colonial power.
Interest in ancient Assyria was so great at one point that it stimulated the production of a wide range of household goods. Demonstrating their comparative lack of impact, though, the lion hunt reliefs themselves don't seem to have played much of a part in the trend.
A great many objects were designed to capture this new craze for ancient Assyria. And a lot of them show lions in various forms, but the only object which I feel was directly inspired by the discovery and then display in the British Museum of Ashurbanipal's lion hunt was this bracelet, which does show exactly some of the scenes which are displayed on those reliefs.
The fact that visitors to the British Museum today are much more appreciative of the lion hunt reliefs than their Victorian predecessors is good news so far as the museum's curators are concerned. They hope that public awareness of them will grow still more in the years ahead, attracting long overdue recognition for Hormuzd Rassam. Discovering the lion hunt reliefs should have brought him both fortune and fame, but for several reasons, including perhaps disdain for his ethnic origins, neither of these things actually came his way.
Somehow or other, he never himself got perhaps the attention he merited. He wrote stalwart books about it, he gave many lectures, but I think there were parties in the British Museum who took again him and tried to blacken his name, and all in all, he's never become a household name, a household figure, which I think, in terms of the history of archaeology, he jolly well deserves.
Just as Rassam is at last getting his rightful recognition, so are the great lion hunt reliefs. These extraordinary carvings, so dynamic and full of movement, so realistic and so accomplished, are some of the most remarkable ancient artifacts ever found.
His name will live on certainly in the lion hunt. They're moving, they're deep, they're powerful, they're beautiful, and it will be there forever.